Okay, welcome back to the software organizations module in Software Engineering 1. This is the last video, and here we're going to talk about software licenses. So in the last video and a little bit in the first modules, we talked about the difference between a sort of traditional software company versus a consultancy. And so if you've looked on LinkedIn or if you've looked at job opportunities, particularly around the Tallahassee area, you'll notice that a bunch of consultancy firms exist in the area, and they are constantly looking for people to staff. So we discussed that the difference between those job opportunities and sort of more traditional software companies is that consultancies really deal in services, and software organizations themselves primarily deal in products. And so even though there might be a services organization associated with IBM or with Google or Microsoft, typically it's a separate sub-organization or department inside of the larger company. But there are tons of consultancies, and that's really all they do is provide services. So we talked about all the different ways that you can develop a product and then get that product to an end user and then receive revenue for that project. So if that thing is a product, you can do things like sell licenses for that product. You can have recurring fees for something like a software as a service offering like Netflix or Hulu or whatever. But you could also do sort of billable hours arrangement for custom development as a consultant or for customization as a consultant, which is the thing we'll go a little bit deeper into in just a moment. So the concept of software licenses really sit under all of this additional complexity. Basically what the idea of software licensing is there is a client and then there is a software developer, and the license dictates how the client or the user can actually use the piece of software that the developer created. And so we've talked about how this affects you as a software engineer, but it also affects other software engineers whose code you're using. So for example, if there is a third-party library that's really, really good, you have to license that third-party piece of software in order to put it into your piece of software. So software licenses exist all over the place. And if you have ever used something like NuGet to get third-party applications, you'll notice that once you install that third-party application, there's always a box that requires you to accept the license agreements so that you're kind of made aware of what happens if you incorporate the piece of software into yours. So we talked briefly last time about how 15 or maybe 20 years ago, you would go to some place like Best Buy and you might buy a physical copy of a piece of software. So you might actually go and buy a CD that had Word on it or whatever. And traditionally what would happen is there would be a license key associated with that physical medium. So there would be some 24-digit character associated with the physical CD, and then once you got to a certain point in the installation, the software installer would actually ask you for that license key. This is extremely similar to what happens with downloads from companies like Microsoft prior to maybe the last couple of years where it's been more implicit licensing. So now what happens is you really don't have to go to a store. What you do is you go to a website, you download the digital medium, and then you basically have some association between your installation and your billing information. So you have some account that's set up. That account is linked to your debit card, to your credit card, and then either you pay one time for the license or you pay in perpetuity until you don't want to use the software anymore. So this mirrors exactly the same sort of classic concept of software licensing, except you don't have a physical copy of the key. It's maybe downloaded implicitly as a file somewhere, like a PFK file, or it's some kind of digital version of a signature that links your actual user to that piece of software. So there are tons of questions around software usage, whether it is an end user trying to use your piece of software, or if it is you trying to use somebody else's piece of software to build your piece of software. Some very common ones are things like, what happens if I download a license and I have a laptop and I have a desktop, and then my parents have a different desktop and my siblings all have laptops? Can I install this same piece of software onto all of those different machines, or do I have to have individual licenses for each of those installations? Things like, what if I download the medium and then delete the medium and then clear my recycle bin, and suddenly I have an installed version of the application, but I no longer have the installer? So was the key that I bought part of those files that I just deleted? If so, is there some way that I can recover the key, so on and so forth? And also, things like, how do you handle bugs? So let's say that you spent $100 or $200 on a license for some sort of software, and then you as a consumer found some problem with it. Does that mean that you're going to raise a bug and then they're going to fix a bug in a new release that now you have to buy that new release? Or are you covered from those types of issues, and you know that once the issue is fixed, you're going to get it backported to whatever version you're currently running on? So these are very common questions, but there are hundreds more, right? And so one of the things about software licensing is this is where the sort of technology of computer science meets the legal world. And so this is a very kind of deep pool to wade into. So we're going to really kind of use these as examples of some of the things that can come up. So license terms themselves are sort of types of licenses or things associated with licenses. And they come in a variety of different forms, and many of you have probably already heard of or read some of these different things. What these things are supposed to do, right, is they're supposed to answer the three questions that we just talked about, but they're also supposed to answer all of the other ambiguous sort of ideas around installing and using your piece of software. So terms of use are things like, what can you and can you not use a piece of software to actually do? So if you buy a PDF creation piece of software, can you use that to commit some sort of forgery or some sort of crime? Clearly not. So that's going to be listed in the terms of use of something that you shouldn't be doing with the application. Terms of service are usually for a more continuous use kind of situation. So terms of service cover things like if you're on a social media platform and you're trying to, raise some sort of militia to do some crazy thing, then they can clearly state in the terms of service that you're not allowed to propagate hate speech, so on and so forth, and they can actually keep you from doing that by blocking your account or locking you out or whatever. These last two are more on the consultancy side of things. So maintenance agreements are particularly for services that you do or kind of one-off projects. They stipulate exactly what kind of bugs are going to be fixed for no cost, and what the kind of release cycle is going to be. So if a client expects a yearly new release, are they going to have to pay for that new release, or is it going to be kind of paid for up front? And maintenance agreements also cover things like what happens if they are hosting a software as a service application that you created. Are you going to maintain the physical servers, or is somebody else going to do it? All those kinds of stipulations are in the maintenance agreement. Master services agreements are typically related to what are called statements of work. So if you have a contract with a client, and you do sort of normal course of service stuff for them. So if you're an IT consultancy, you might hook up their printers and do their networking, but you may also do kind of low-level coding for custom applications that they need. So the master services agreement does things like stipulate what your billable rate is. It stipulates how many hours you're allowed to spend on a type of project before you have to get additional okay or approval from the client. It covers things like warranties and all sorts of stuff for the services that you're conducting, so that you don't have to like reinvent all of this legalese every time you engage in a very small project for the same client. So you might have dozens of projects, and you can have one master services agreement that kind of umbrella covers all of these kind of legal issues. So the take-home message is that if you have a question as a client or as an end user, you should be able to go to one of these documents associated with your license, and you should be able to answer the question. If you can't answer the question, that means that there is some ambiguity, and then it's really up to precedent, or it's up to the interpretation of the license terms. And often you can kind of negotiate with the client or with the company whose software you're using to sort of reach some reasonable kind of in the middle interpretation. So going back to consultancy versus traditional company, we've talked about one-off projects. And what you have in a one-off project is a very tight kind of proposal for what the software team is going to do and then provide to the business team. And at the end of the day, what you want is you want requirements, but you also want things like diagrams, and you want user stories, and you want all of that kind of stuff approved before you actually get started working in earnest. So once all of that stuff is approved, most of the time that constitutes a legally binding agreement between you and the client. And once that binding agreement is executed, basically you go out and you do the work, and once you can show that you've done the work, you deliver the work to the client, and then they're happy, and then your side of the bargain is done. They offer you payment that's stipulated in the proposal, and everybody's happy. For products, you typically don't have this kind of proposal between an end user and the software company. What typically happens is you have an organization inside of the software company that owns the product. So for example, at Microsoft, there's a team that owns Visual Studio. There's a team that owns all of or part of Office. And so those organizations have business analysts, they have project managers, and those people kind of drive the roadmap for the product. They figure out what features are going to be in the next release, they figure out what bugs are going to be fixed. And the license terms and the proposals and the contracts are not between the software organization and those internal teams. It's really between the software organization overall, so Microsoft, and the person who is sitting down in front of Visual Studio to write some code. So there's a difference in who is the client and who is actually bound by these legal requirements between a consultancy and a product service situation. So when you're thinking about what a software license is, it's really important that you think about the two parties that are in the agreement. So if you are working at Microsoft and you are trying to incorporate a piece of software into one of Microsoft's pieces of software, Microsoft would be the end user in that situation, and then some other software vendor would be the actual software team. That seems weird, but it's absolutely possible for a software team to be the business team if you're trying to use something like a UI framework, or if you're using a messaging framework or something like that to build your piece of software. So project proposals for services essentially are between an external client and a software engineering firm, and it's very kind of rigidly put together. License terms are also rigidly put together, but they're often between a software engineering firm and an end user that basically has no control over the delivery or the sort of future of the product. So you, as a user of Visual Studio, you can certainly propose new features, you can propose bugs, but ultimately the people who are in control of the Visual Studio team inside of Microsoft are the people who call the shots. So that's a drastically different situation or context to have a legal agreement in, so it's important that you kind of think through those things. So the idea of license terms is that if you don't have them, then everything is left up to interpretation. So you as a user can interpret whatever you want, and a software vendor or you as a software vendor can also interpret whatever you want. And so disagreements on either side of the relationship that's contractually bound by these obligations could be very kind of different, and the ambiguity there causes lots and lots of problems. So you can think of things like terms of service, again, that keep people from committing violent acts or coordinating some sort of violent act on a social media platform, or people using social media platforms to scam people, so on and so forth. And so you kind of can think of all of these precedents that would probably be set at some point, and as they come up, or hopefully you think of them before somebody tries to do it, you include those things in the terms of service so that if it actually happens, you are protected by a binding agreement from your user. Things like terms of use can distance your software firm from somebody who is cranking out fake money or fake checks with your PDF viewing software or creating software. It can also help you if you are trying to host data and somehow that data is illegal, so you would be distanced from the person who's actually committing the crime. And even though you are potentially hosting data related to a crime, you wouldn't be at fault because the terms of use clearly dictate who owns the data regardless of where it's hosted or who's hosting it. This can also help you if you are trying to do something like license a very small product like Snagit, or another desktop application that's only a couple of dollars per license. These applications typically require a license per install or per user. So a terms of use item could keep a very large company with maybe 50,000 employees from installing one license 50,000 times instead of giving you 50,000 times the $9 install. So it protects you from a huge discrepancy in expected revenue. And so that is a very kind of major use case for terms of use. And master services agreements are really, really important because if you are providing services for a very large organization, that very large organization very often has a legal team, and that legal team could potentially come back and use what's called a perceived lack of functionality. So they could say, it's obvious from our requirements that there is a missing requirement, and it should have been obvious to you that it was missing, and you didn't say anything, and now it's a missing feature, and this feature isn't a new feature, it's actually a bug because it was supposed to be there all along. And very large organizations with legal teams can actually attempt to dictate your application's roadmap, so where you're going to go in the future with that application, by essentially holding you hostage for loopholes in your master services agreement. So you can very clearly state that this is it, anything that isn't listed in the list of requirements or in the diagrams or in the user stories is not covered under the current arrangement, and so anything that's added to that, even if it is perceived to be lack of functionality, will have to be billed separately. So this is kind of a common issue that comes up. It's one thing to have a piece of paper that restricts end users from doing something untoward. So it's one thing to have a very long terms of service that kind of absolves you from 10,000 different things that an end user could do to get you in trouble. But ultimately, if you can't find that user and you can't keep them honest, then you can't do anything about it. So potentially you could mitigate risk if you were taken to court. You could dodge that risk. But ultimately, you kind of want to be as proactive as physically possible. One of the ways that you can do this is by automatically registering the product to an end user and then collecting metadata about that end user. So typically this is done by collecting the end user's zip code potentially, or their email address, or some sort of identifying piece of information, so that if your application exposes your company to risk, you can at least have a link between what user is doing what illegal thing in whatever data that you manage, so on and so forth. So this could also help you if you're concerned about a user misusing a license, so downloading a license one time and then applying it or installing it to their 7,000 friends' computers, you can link the registration key to a user on the server, and then you can restrict them from installing that same license twice. So essentially you would force them to uninstall the first one before they install it on the second machine, so on and so forth. There's also the concept of digital rights management. So this is usually used to protect video game developers from having someone pirate a game and then use the pirated game on their proprietary hardware. If you are familiar with PlayStation 1, there was a huge kind of issue where it was a very well-known hack that you could go in and modify your PS1 to get around a lot of these kind of digital rights management issues. That's been strengthened substantially since those days. But digital rights management can also be used for all sorts of different types of software. So what this is trying to do, though, is it's trying to keep you from risk associated with piracy, typically, or something in that general vein. So probably the most complicated part of or way of dealing with this is called call home auditing. So basically what is going to happen is somewhere at your company, you're going to have a server that has access to usage data. So you're going to understand not only a link between a user and that user's installation, but also potentially that user's employer and that user's employer's other users. This allows you to manage how many licenses a firm is using. It allows you to back bill them if they are using too many licenses they aren't actually paying for. So this is typically for larger kind of enterprise level software as a service offerings. And it allows you to recoup revenue that you could have lost just because the client honestly isn't even thinking about licensing when they're trying to do their job. So call home auditing requires a server in-house that the clients that the users are using actually call back to enforce license requirements. So it will tell you how many different machines have the product installed, how much usage, so how many PDFs are you generating, how many service calls are you making, so on and so forth. And it helps you understand if you are covering your costs, so are you covering hosting fees, if you need to increase the cost for the next maintenance period, so on and so forth. It is definitely the most complicated because it requires sort of two-way communication, and it also requires a substantial amount of storage if you have a ton of users to store that metadata. So we've talked almost exclusively about the link between using a piece of software, its licenses, and its ability to generate revenue for a company, but it is obvious that not all pieces of software are paid to use. So there is a whole wide world of open source software that has license terms, but those license terms are not necessarily tied to billing, but they are used to understand if the thing that is using that open source software itself becomes open source, or if there are any ramifications on using open source software in a pay-to-use situation. So software licensing, again, is like a legal concept, largely, and this whole discussion is not necessarily intended to be legal advice. And so one of the biggest things, particularly for group projects that you want to go forward with and sort of continue to work on after the semester, is you have to be very cognizant of what kind of open source software you're using and what licenses you're agreeing to when you start incorporating third-party components into your piece of software. So we're going to talk about the kind of two ends of the continuum in terms of open source licenses. but it's very, very important that you're aware of what licenses you're carrying in your application, and sort of what the binding requirements of those licenses are. So the open source initiative itself is basically a group that maintains standards and legal definitions for a whole bunch of different very common licenses. You can go to this website directly from this link in the PowerPoint, and it lists all of the sort of approved licenses for open source software. And so it also provides licensed language, and it provides sort of additional resources for each one of them. So if there's particularly weird clauses, in a lot of the licenses will actually try to explain via example what those clauses actually mean. So what's important is that you spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes of your life going to this link and trying to understand what these licenses look like, and how they might be similar to something that you yourself have experienced in your life. So something like the Apple Terms of Service that happens every time you install the latest iOS version to your phone. You probably roll your eyes and click OK because you don't have an alternative. But the language in that Apple Terms of Service is probably very similar to some of the language that's in these licenses, and it's important that you kind of draw the parallel there. So on one end of the continuum, you have what's called the MIT license. So the MIT license is extremely non-restrictive, and basically allows the developers that are using anything with an MIT license unfettered access to whatever that piece of software is. So if you look at that previously discussed link, you will see this is the license text, and this is the entirety of it. The underlined part is essentially saying that you can use the piece of software without restriction. You can copy it, you can modify it, merge it, publish it, distribute it, sub-license, or sell copies of it to whoever you want to. So this sell copies of it is really the crazy part. What this means is you could take something with the MIT license, you could essentially fork the repository, you could update the splash screen, or you could do some minor modification, and then you could turn around and you could sell it to other people for a profit. But that person is obviously going to be able to go out and search and find a free version, and so it's unlikely that you'd be able to actually capitalize on that markup. But this is probably the least restrictive license that you can find. And so if you find a third-party component that you want to use, like a grid control or a messaging framework or something like that inside of your app, if it has the MIT license, you are probably totally fine to use it, and even if you want to ultimately license your piece of software for a cost. So there are lots of terms that get thrown around, and they seem to impose this kind of false dichotomy situation that we've been kind of trying to get away from this semester. So just like everything else that we've talked about, these situations are really, again, kind of a continuum. So what open source means is that the actual source code itself is freely available. You can go somewhere, you can download it, you can compile it, you can modify it, you can figure out how to copy it. It's available to you in some way. Closed source means that the source code itself is an extremely closely guarded secret. So you could potentially get access to it if it is compiled and in binary form. So essentially you can have an executable version of the code, but it is not possible to get the sort of uncompiled version. Now there are decompilers, and so if you're familiar with something like .peek for .NET Framework, you can actually go into basically any executable or any DLL, and you can get the source code out of it by decompiling it. So there are tons of obfuscation tools that you can use to try to make that less possible. But the idea of closed source is that the source code itself is something very similar to the Coca-Cola formula or the KFC chicken recipe or whatever. It's something that the company does not necessarily want you to have access to. But you can see these two things are kind of diametrically opposed, but neither of them say anything about the legality of having access to the code. So you also have the concept of commercial versus free-to-use software. So if an application or a piece of code is commercial or pay to use, and you're using it without buying a license, then you're actually performing an illegal activity. You're pirating that software. You're doing something that's untoward in itself. So even if you have access through something like a decompiler, and you have decompiled pay-to-use closed source software, and you have copied it into your own project structure and you can run it, that is a form of piracy. It isn't necessarily legal just because you can physically do it. And it's also possible to have something like open source pay-to-use software. So it is possible that a person went out and built an application and will give you open source access to it, but you have to pay for access to the software. So it's potentially not completely open source. You have to pay for a license to the code itself, or there's some other sort of arrangement that has to be met. So again, there are a million different ways that these things can be mixed and matched. And just talking about the different types of license terms, you can kind of get a picture of how broad this situation can become. So one of the other things that we talked about in the previous video is that software customization is this sort of gigantic cottage industry that a lot of people don't necessarily think about when they're thinking about software engineering itself. So for example, you can go coast to coast and you can find, well, actually all over the world, but coast to coast in the US, and find firms that use Salesforce.com or SAP, and these are gigantic companies like Walmart and like GP. They usually have to have some sort of data management solution, and Salesforce.com and SAP are very, very popular ones. So even though two companies like Walmart and GP or Home Depot or some of these other large companies might be paying for the exact same framework, their implementations themselves are usually drastically different. So their implementations are customized to the point that they are very distinguishable from one another, and you might not even understand at the surface that they're using the same framework. So customization basically is like Legos. So the corporation or the company goes out and they buy licenses for the framework, and then they buy customization from some sort of consultancy, or maybe the consultancy or services arm of the same company, and the billing situation goes both ways. You have to pay a license fee for the framework, and you have to pay for hours to actually bend the framework into whatever shape you want it to be in. So if you think about Legos, you can make an infinite number of things out of Legos, and that is the services part, putting these sort of cogs and blocks together in whatever order the client wants them in, but you can't necessarily go down and modify a 6-peg block into a 4-peg block, or suddenly come up with a star-shaped block of your own, because there are specific closed source license agreements or license terms for each of those individual pieces. So this is a situation that kind of spans the gambit. You have master services agreements with the consultancy that's doing the customization work, but you also have license terms that you have to abide by for the individual components for the framework that you're using. So we talked about how the MIT license is certainly on the sort of unrestricted part of the continuum. The GPU-GNL license is way more restrictive and has way more components to it. So if you remember, we had that sort of one screen capture, and it was like maybe a paragraph and a half of text. If you go to the GPU-GNL license at the link that I had previously in the presentation, you will see that it is pages and pages and pages of stuff. You can actually go to this link to get there directly. And so there is the concept of copyleft and copyright. GPU-GNL is a copyleft license, which means that if you use a piece of software that is licensed under GPU-GNL, you have to meet the equivalent license. So if you're trying to use GPU-GNL software in a pay-to-use piece of code, you can't actually do it because you have to have an equivalent license for your piece of software. So, for example, if you wanted to build a piece of software and then license it under the MIT license, you would not be able to do that with a GPU-GNL component because the MIT license is much less restrictive than the GPU-GNL license is. So this is the exact kind of situation you don't want to find yourself in, that you have created the world's next great social media platform and suddenly you have to take it down because you've used GPU-GNL license components, and now everything is open source through at least this license, if not something more restrictive. So if you incorporate a third-party component under this license, what will typically happen is you are going to accidentally open source your code. You don't necessarily want to do that. So what you want to be cognizant of is the licenses that are associated with all of the third-party components that you have in your system. And typically, software companies try to keep a list of this and do kind of an annual or a quarterly audit to make sure that they're not inadvertently causing a lot of license discrepancy issues. So license compatibility itself is a huge problem for firms, particularly the larger that they get. So if you have a globally distributed software company and you have someone in a different continent that is using third-party applications or third-party libraries, you don't have any visibility into what those libraries' license terms are, you can find yourself in a huge problem because of misunderstandings in your organizational structure. So you could have an engineer on their first day of work start using GPU-GNL code in your closed source system, and then you have a huge problem. So this kind of flies in the face of reuse, right? So you've been taught over and over and over again that reinventing the wheel is kind of counter to the entire idea of computer science. But what you need to do is you need to make sure that you're reusing code that was intended to be reused for its purpose. So this also applies to things like APIs. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that your use of an API or a library is in line with its software license terms, because if it's not, it can come back to haunt you later. So the larger the firm and the more cognizant of risk the firm is, the more likely that they're to have audits of all these third-party components. And the biggest problem that you could have is you miss a compatibility issue. You go out into the world with a piece of software, and now you run into a situation where you can't use that one piece of software that has a compatibility issue anymore, and now either your license terms are solidified to something you don't want them to be, or you find yourself doing major refactor work on the back end, trying to refactor or reconstruct some sort of very restrictively licensed piece of software that you didn't intend to build from the very beginning. So that can also lead to overages. It can lead to budget issues. So being aware of license compatibility up front kind of fixes all of those issues so you don't have to worry about it. So that brings our software organization conversation to a close. So I hope that this is a little bit eye-opening. It's kind of an off-the-beaten-path topic. And as always, if you have questions, comments, concerns about anything, please let me know. And I'll also be posting a video shortly about sort of the week recap for this module. Thanks very much, and see you next time.